You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
I've spoken in previous episodes and recent episodes about British Israelism, the claim that the British are the direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, a belief that relies a great deal on pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology, and masks a decidedly racist worldview. Among the additional claims by British Israelists is the story that the prophet Jeremiah traveled in the company of Egyptian royalty to Ireland in the 6th century BCE, and with him he carried certain holy relics, the Ark of the Covenant, and the Stone of Destiny, also known as Jacob's Pillow. There are numerous competing traditions in Ireland and Britain about this Stone of Destiny, and as I've spoken about before, British Israelists desecrated the Hill of Tara near the Irish contender for the Stone of Destiny, the Leothol, in their efforts to uncover the resting place of the Ark. All of these claims linking Britain to stories from the Bible, featuring ancient visitors from the Near East carrying sacred and powerful relics, are dubious in the extreme. But interestingly, they are not alone. These arguments echo another story, popular in the Middle Ages, which has entered modern myth today and continues to be believed by some who see in it a hidden historical truth, despite the fact that it was introduced through the fanciful legends of the Arthurian literary tradition. There are those, too, who may claim that Arthurian legend was real, but most people accept this body of medieval romances as nothing but fantasy. How strange it is, then, that one motif and thread in the cycle of Arthurian tales, that of the quest for the Holy Grail, is viewed as real by some who even reject the stories in which it appeared. These believers will suggest that the poets who penned Arthurian romances must have incorporated pre-existing traditions about a real Christian relic, or that they were cryptically revealing some hidden truth regarding this artifact, which was far more real than the chivalric adventure stories in which it appeared. These believers, for the most part, contend that what can be trusted in the medieval romances, the kernel of truth at their heart, is that a certain vessel used by Christ at the Last Supper was thereafter used to collect his blood when he was crucified, making of Christ's seemingly metaphorical dinnertime conversation about drinking his blood, the blood of the covenant, into something far more literal, and imbuing the vessel, which would come to be called a quote-unquote Grail, with some divine power, or at least significance. Afterward, Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple now venerated as a saint, took Christ's body down from the cross and provided a tomb for his interment. And it is this figure, Joseph of Arimathea, who it is said took this Grail along with the holy lance that pierced Christ's side on the cross and traveled with them to ancient Britain, where he became the first Christian bishop of the British Isles and ensured that these relics would thereafter be protected. Thus it entered Arthurian legend, where the family of Joseph of Arimathea, known as the Grail family, kept the relics through the ages, their lives supernaturally extended by the taking of the host or sacrament from the Grail. Though to many it may seem a silly question to ask, akin to asking what is the historical basis of the Lord of the Rings, the number of later traditions and works of fiction and pseudo-history and conspiracy theory that treat the Holy Grail as if it were real obliges me to determine what, if any, real basis the legend may have in reality. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and this is my quest for the truth of the Holy Grail. Before we start, I want to thank my new patrons, Kurt, Bree Nagarin, Christopher L. Burton, and Gavin Ellis. Additional thanks to Luis Alvarado for your generous donation on PayPal. Thanks so much to all my patrons and everyone who supports the show in other ways as well, like by signing up for HelloFresh with the link and discount code from my campaign, which is in the show notes. If you pledge on Patreon, you can get ad-free and exclusive episodes. I've promised one mini-sode a month, but I've been on a streak for a long time of always releasing something exclusive between each episode. For example, after my episode on the myth of a thuggy cult, I released one about the actual MacGuffin of the Temple of Doom, the Shankara Stones. And after my episode on the Order of Assassins, I released a minisode on the Black Stone of the Kaaba, which I think was really interesting and touches on stuff I would hesitate to cover on an episode for general release. Patron feeds also get episodes early, and, as mentioned, their episodes are not interrupted by advertisements or Patreon pitches like this. So visit patreon.com/historicalblindness and support the show. Or you can support the show by making a one-time donation at historicalblindness.com/donate, or at the PayPal link in the show notes, or on Venmo. Just search at Historical Blindness. Now, on with the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. As you have probably already figured out, if you've been listening to my episodes for the last few months, this is yet another of my explorations of the history and the legends that served as the basis of the Indiana Jones films. I've been really enjoying digging deeper into these topics and rewatching the films as I look forward to the release of the final, long-awaited film of the series, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. This isn't a paid advertisement, I just really love these movies. As a MacGuffin for an Indiana Jones film, the Holy Grail seems absolutely perfect. It serves as the Christian counterpart to the Ark of the Covenant, in that it was of divine origin, even containing within it the very power or essence of God, and was capable of performing miracles by some readings of the source material. In fact, it has even been discussed in my principal source for this episode, The Holy Grail, Imagination and Belief by Richard Barber, as a kind of Christian allegory for the Ark, with Joseph of Arimathea's wanderings with it representative of the Israelites' wanderings through the wilderness with the Ark. But more than that, since a MacGuffin is something quested after, the Holy Grail is one of the most famous MacGuffins of all. For Indy to quest after the Grail was for him to take part in a long literary tradition. Far more even than the Ark of the Covenant, the idea of undertaking a quest to find or discover the true nature of the Holy Grail has always been a large part of the legend. The nature of what that search meant, however, has evolved with the story through the years.
It is interesting because if you consider where the original Grail stories were kind of popping up in European history, it was the time of the Crusades. It was a time when religious faith was a very animating factor in a lot of decisions. And then that later became less important. I know by the time that Mallory was writing in the 1400s, there was kind of a different objective in telling Grail stories at that time, which was to, I believe, to coalesce some sense of British identity And so that's why there was so much focus on King Arthur and the Grail as sort of collateral within the whole King Arthur sort of cinematic universe, so to speak. But the purposes of that, I think, was largely because England was going through or had just come out of the Wars of the Roses, and the Tudors were just on their way up and that sort of thing. And so there was a very concerted project to construct British identity at that point in time. So I think that is different.
That is Dr. Sean Munger, historian, author, podcaster, YouTuber, and friend and patron of this program, who kindly agreed to chat with me about this topic, as he has produced some great videos and an entire online class on the Holy Grail.
And then I think in our own time, we see the de-emphasizing of the religious aspects of it, as we see in Monty Python and Indiana Jones and such, where the Grail is now kind of a MacGuffin. It's like the Maltese Falcon. It's sort of the same thing. It's, from a storytelling standpoint, it functions. It's a functional piece of a plot. That in a way that maybe that it reflects, values of our culture, where so much activity is geared toward economic gain and enriching ourselves for the purpose of enriching ourselves. And therefore, an item like the Holy Grail, which used to have these powerful redemptive powers, is now kind of reduced to sort of a symbol of gain. It's something you get, and you become rich and powerful as a result of having possession of it. It sort of floats through a number of different iterations of what our culture values at any particular time when we're talking about the Holy Grail.
You'll be hearing more from him throughout the episode. I'd like to thank him for chatting with me.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me on. I've been listening to your show for years, really love it, and really a great gift to be able to be on.
In another regard, the Holy Grail again seems to have been a perfect MacGuffin, since Nazis were genuinely interested in the legend of Percival, the Arthurian knight tasked with questing after the Grail. Just as Arthurian legend became very important to the construction of national identity in Britain, so too it slowly became embraced by Germans and reinvented as a text foundational to their own Teutonic racial identity.
The project of building German national identity was, 600 or 800 years long. I mean, they started in the early Middle Ages and didn't really finish it until the late 19th century. They were grasping at really anything that would be useful in a cultural sense.
This began in the early 19th century with German romantics adapting Arthurian legends featuring the Grail, and reached its apogee with the creation of Richard Wagner's mid-19th century opera, Parzival.
Whether it was sort of appropriating kind of Norse type of themes, or Wagner's ideas about, kind of musical nationalism, referenced a lot of these kinds of medieval legends as if it was this continuous thread that represented, this is German identity has this long continuity, and it really didn't, but a lot of people had a vested interest in portraying it as if it did.
Adolf Hitler was a great admirer of Wagner's operas and viewed them as an important touchstone for the heroic nationalist myth that he promoted in Nazi Germany. And as Wagner was himself an anti-Semite and racist, his work and the resurgent myths they focused on, including that of the Holy Grail, became a major element of Nazi identity.
The Nazis sort of took on that project, but as usual didn't understand what that project had been like in reality, and then they also misappropriated it for their own goals. So yeah, the Nazis were both sort of bad actors, but also bad historians in pretty much every way, because they misunderstood every historical circumstance that they ever got their hands on, as many of your episodes have demonstrated.
But it should be emphasized that the Nazis were never out searching for the Grail as if it were a real artifact. The Ahnenerbe, about whom I spoke a great deal in my series on Nazi occultism, was actually interested in scholarly evidence of an Aryan precursor race, and hunting down a Christian relic would not have served their purpose. The notion in Last Crusade that the Nazis were after the Grail actually derives from the claim that Hitler was obsessed with another relic of the crucifixion that was featured in the same Arthurian legend as the Holy Grail, the Holy Lance. This item, also called the Lance of Longinus, had already been mythologized as a kind of supernatural MacGuffin that Hitler was seeking in the 1972 occult book The Spear of Destiny by Trevor Ravenscroft, which was undoubtedly an influence on the Indiana Jones films generally, in that it portrayed Hitler as being obsessed with acquiring Jewish and Christian relics. Ravenscroft's book is a work of pseudo-history, and like the Holy Lance, the legend of the Holy Grail too evolved in more modern times to be embraced not only as a powerful symbol by Jungian psychoanalysts and New Age enthusiasts, but as a literal object or hidden secret by pseudo-historians and conspiracy theorists who see in its legend a kind of coded treasure hunt. I've explored this before in my episodes The Priory of Sion and The Quest for the Holy Grail, and to a lesser degree, The Secret of Rennes-le-Château and Abbé Sagnier's Riches. But those were early episodes and narrow in focus. I'll mention the subject matter of those episodes again later, and it may be worth revisiting them after you listen to this. But for this episode, the question is of the historicity of Grail legend. The very name of the third indie film, The Last Crusade, seems to indicate some genuine historicity to the legend of the Grail. But unlike the Grail quests of Arthurian legend, the Crusades were real historical events. Indeed, some who have viewed the Indiana Jones film but lack further historical knowledge may mistakenly believe that the Crusades were about searching for the Holy Grail. That is not the case at all.
Well, again, the simple answer is they had nothing to do with the Holy Grail. I mentioned this in my video on the Indiana Jones film, that the title is highly misleading because it suggests that the Last Crusade, it suggests that previous crusades had something to do with the Holy Grail, and they really didn't. In fact, none of the medieval literature talks about the Holy Grail being in the Holy Land, at least not after Christ's crucifixion. It's always in Britain or in some other part of Europe. So it's not as if it was an object that Knights of the Crusade were questing for. So the real Crusades, of course, the historical Crusades, were the series of conflicts between countries of Western Europe and the Islamic world, beginning in 1095. And the usual, although not the exclusive, objective of the Crusades was the conquest of Jerusalem by Christians. And then subsequent Crusades were either about getting Jerusalem back, because it went back to the Muslims in 1187. After the First Crusade, there were several Crusader states under Christian rule that were set up, and then some of those were retaken by Muslims. And so subsequent Crusades were about getting those back. And then, of course, the Fourth Crusade didn't even make it to the Holy Land, sacked Constantinople instead. So the Crusades really have nothing explicitly to do with the Holy Grail, but I think they're important as a context for how these stories were, first of all, created, and then how they were sort of disseminated and interpreted. Because there was such an emphasis during the Crusades on redemption, the idea that going to the Holy Land on crusade would wash away your sins, and this was a holy war that was being undertaken for Christendom specifically, the Holy Grail stories kind of mirrored that idea, that the Grail is profoundly transformative and you can only attain it when you have the right faith and the right mindset, and it has the same effect. It redeems your sins, basically. So I think that quest for redemption, and these poems and stories were written during the time of the Crusades and shortly after the time of the Crusades, reflecting that same thing, that redemption is a good end unto itself, and here's a story about redemption that centers around the Holy Grail, but in real life, there's this redemptive quest that people from Western Europe can go on in the form of the Crusades. So it's more context and allegory than it is anything direct.
In fact, the launching of the Third Crusade was, in some ways, undertaken to recover a supposed relic of the crucifixion. The kings of the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem had long held a fragment of wood supposed to be a piece of the true cross, and their armies carried it with them into battle. When Saladin defeated Crusader forces in 1187, that piece of the true cross fell into Muslim hands, and many European preachers urged the launching of another crusade to recover it. It was exactly during this period when the idea of the recovery of a relic of the crucifixion was being used to encourage further crusades that the first Arthurian romance featuring the Holy Grail was composed. In France, or more specifically Flanders, by a poet named Chrétien de Troyes. Here we find the only further potential connection between the Grail and the Crusades, in that the poet Chrétien de Troyes dedicated his works to his patron.
His patron was Philip of Alsace, and he went on crusade. So the political purpose, to the extent there was one, may have been to kind of demonstrate again this theme of redemption, that this Lord is traveling to the Holy Land to seek redemption for all of Christendom, and his court poet is doing this story that has kind of a similar allegory. That may have been done partially to sort of pump up the religious qualifications of Philip of Alsace and other crusaders from France. So in that sense, de Troyes' poem might have been politically useful. So it's a context that I think is worth exploring.
Thus, it is entirely possible that Chrétien de Troyes introduced the element of a quest for a relic of the crucifixion, animating the knights of his chivalric romance as a kind of propaganda for further crusades. In The Last Crusade, the legends of King Arthur are only mentioned in an offhand way, dismissed as fairy tales. Yet the Grail is presented as a historical object, which of course has misled many fans of the film who know little else about the legend besides what the film portrays, to believe it was a real object. The question of whether or not it was real, however, may be simply answered.
It is a medieval invention, and it is a literary invention, as opposed to it's not a specific historical artifact. There are artifacts that people have claimed over many centuries to be the Holy Grail, but it's not as if we know that there was a Holy Grail, an object that was defined as that, and we're just arguing about which one in the modern world it is. It's not like that. It was invented in the Middle Ages, and it was a literary creation.
And it appears to have been invented by Chrétien de Troyes between 1181 and 1190. In his work, The Story of the Grail, also called Percival, we are introduced to the young knight of Arthur's Round Table, Percival, who encounters a king out fishing on a river, the Fisher King, who invites Percival to his castle. At the castle, Percival witnesses a strange procession, which includes a man bearing a bleeding lance and a woman carrying a fine, expensive-looking, quote-unquote, Grail. Percival, who had been taught not to speak out of turn, says nothing, and later is admonished for not having asked about the Grail and whom it, quote-unquote, served. Beyond this, as Chrétien de Troyes' work was unfinished, little more is said of the Grail and its history or nature, except that it contained a piece of sacramental bread that kept the Fisher King alive. Interestingly, most elements of the legend are not clearly established in the work. The Grail is not identified as being a relic of the crucifixion, or even being a sacred relic at all. In fact, in de Troyes' description, it was to be seen more as a, quote, rich Grail, end quote, than a holy one. The notion of its holiness was not really established until the, quote-unquote, continuations of de Troyes' work, when a series of poets, some anonymous, attempted to further his work or complete it during the following 20 years. In the first of these, the author suddenly uses the full title, calling it the Holy Grail, as if this had already been established. However, scholars analyzing the language of these continuations have determined that they must have been written by French poets of the same region, who may even have served the same patron, raising the possibility that they knew something of de Troyes' intentions and where he was headed with the story. There are some elements of de Troyes' original work that do hint at the eventual direction the continuations and later derivative works would take. The Grail is said to hold a special host wafer that extends the Fisher King's life, thus clearly connecting it with the Christian ritual said to have first been established by Christ at the Last Supper. And indeed, the leading question, the secret of whom the Grail served, seems to have clearly been a setup for the later reveal that it had served Christ, in that it was used at the Last Supper. Lastly, de Troyes' portrayal of the bleeding lance can only be interpreted as a depiction of the Holy Lance, which was typically described as having blood running down it. It seems pretty evident that de Troyes was indeed heading in the direction that later writers eventually took the story. But this has led some to suggest that he wasn't actually inventing the story, that he was actually retelling an ancient tale. Chrétien de Troyes himself speaks of a source book that his patron gave him, but from the way he refers to it only vaguely, this seems to only be a literary device. Later scholars have suggested that Arthurian legends such as Percival's were derived from ancient Celtic legends, as seen in texts such as the Mabinogion. And the argument is convincing for some other Arthurian legends, but no clear connection can be discerned with the story of the Grail. Still though, as we will see, there may have been some pre-existing tradition that inspired Chrétien de Troyes, as well as those who continued his work. Now for a brief intermission. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now, you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Now, back to the show. Among the French poets who expanded on the work of Chrétien de Troyes, the man most responsible for the creation of the Holy Grail myth as we know it today was Robert de Boron, writing about a century later. It was de Boron who revealed the nature of the Grail as being a crucifixion relic, and it was he who developed the supposed history behind it, telling of Joseph of Arimathea's involvement, and thereby giving the entire legend a biblical cast. But the actual biblical basis for this Christian dimension to the story may surprise some.
I can sum it up in one word: none. The Holy Grail is not mentioned in any book of the Bible, and there is no scriptural basis for it. The various places where it's said to have appeared, such as at the Last Supper or its appearance at the crucifixion, those events, of course, are heavily detailed in the Bible, but the Holy Grail itself is never mentioned. That is one thing that sets it aside from, for example, the Hofburg spear or the Holy Lance, which is what the Hofburg spear artifact is supposed to be. There is a mention, a reference to a soldier piercing the side of Christ. That is in Scripture, but the Holy Grail is actually not mentioned.
The extent of the scriptural evidence is only the existence of Joseph of Arimathea.
Well, it's not entirely certain. My feeling is that he did exist, and the reason I say that is because there are several kind of he appears in several converging sources. He's mentioned in all of the canonical books of the New Testament that describe Christ's crucifixion. He's described differently and identified differently in those books, by the way, but he is mentioned. The most traditional explanation is that he's the person who provided his tomb as the tomb of Christ, and he was also involved in preparing Christ's body for burial. He apparently was a follower of Christ, but beyond that, we're just really not sure. And we know virtually nothing about his life as a historical figure. There's a suggestion that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling council in Judea. Of course, Judea was ruled by the Romans at that time, but they're kind of autonomous council. He may have been a member of that council, but there's virtually nothing about his life that we can pin down for sure. So Scripture is really all we have to go with, and the books of the Scripture, as is well known, don't really agree with one another, except in kind of more general ways. So getting at the historicity of someone, a collateral figure like Joseph of Arimathea, is exceptionally difficult.
The notion that Joseph of Arimathea may have been a member of the Sanhedrin appears to have derived from his association with Nicodemus, a Pharisee who is clearly stated to have been a member of that assembly of rabbis, and who in the Gospel of John helps Joseph of Arimathea prepare the body. Interestingly, pretty much everything about Joseph of Arimathea from Robert de Boron's work appears to have been cribbed not from the canonical scriptures, but from the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, which I've mentioned before in a few episodes. In that work, Joseph of Arimathea is arrested and imprisoned after placing Christ in his tomb. But when they open his cell to kill him, they find he has disappeared. When Joseph is eventually found, he says that Christ visited him in his cell and released him. What de Boron added was that Christ brought with him the chalice from which he drank during the Last Supper, which had earlier been used to collect his blood on the cross, and commanded Joseph to keep it safe, whereupon Joseph took it away to ancient Britain.
He's mentioned as having taken the Grail from the Holy Land to England. The traditional resting place is Glastonbury Abbey in England, which he supposedly founded. Again, these are all legends that post-date biblical scripture. Did he actually make it to England? There's no evidence of that. It would have been quite an arduous journey in the 1st century CE, but it's not impossible.
And it's unclear why Joseph would choose Britain, of all places.
Who knows? Because we know nothing about his life. We know nothing about what was going on with him. So maybe there was a compelling reason, and maybe it did happen. There's just no records. One thing that is interesting about Britain in this period, and I believe I mentioned this in my class, but I know that I've mentioned it in other places, that what's generally called Dark Age Britain, the Dark Ages are not really said to have begun until after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but this era of British history before really the consolidation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and that kind of stuff is thought to generally be a Dark Age, but there's considerable evidence that it wasn't. Like, Byzantine coins have been found in places on the west coast of England from this period, and there was clearly a lot of trade going on, and there's evidence that literacy was higher than has generally been thought of. So it may be that Britain in the 1st century CE was considerably more cosmopolitan than we generally give it credit for. So that's why I can't close the door on this possibility entirely. We just have no evidence of it.
100 years after Chrétien de Troyes seems to have invented the Grail and hinted about its secrets, Robert de Boron incorporated Apocrypha to flesh out that secret, and he may also have been weaving in an older tradition that could possibly have inspired de Troyes himself. As in my principal source, The Holy Grail, Imagination and Belief, Richard Barber reveals that there existed an iconographic motif in artwork depicting the crucifixion that shows figures standing beside the cross and catching Christ's spilled blood in a chalice. Some examples of this iconography predate the work of Chrétien de Troyes by nearly 300 years. This certainly seems to be the origin of Robert de Boron's conception of the Holy Grail as both the chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper and the cup that caught his blood. There's a problem, however, with the idea that this iconography inspired Chrétien de Troyes' original invention of the Grail, though. As in its original form, it appears this thing called the quote-unquote Grail was never meant to be a chalice or cup at all. Many assume that the word Grail means cup or chalice and always has, but that is not the case.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things about the Grail legend is that the sources can't agree on what it is. And I think that's why there's so much debate over what that word Grail means, or Graal, or whatever the original word was in high medieval French. But it's true that, I mean, in the modern world, we're generally conditioned to assume that it was a cup of chalice or some kind. But that honestly has so much more to do with our perception of that has so much more to do with Monty Python and Steven Spielberg than it does with any medieval source. So that's a very interesting aspect of the legend.
The meaning and etymology of the word Grail, or Graal in the Old French, as used by Chrétien de Troyes, is unclear. Some think that it derived from the Latin cratus, for woven basket, and that this evolved to mean other kinds of vessels and receptacles. Most, however, think that it derives from the Latin gradale, signifying some kind of dish or cup. Those in the cup camp see the Latin word as having derived from an earlier Greek word, crater, for a cup with two handles, but it may have derived from the Latin garalis, which was a dish that Romans used to serve fish. Indeed, all signs in the original Grail text by Chrétien de Troyes point to the word being used to refer to a shallow dish from which meat would be served in a sauce. At one point, when a hermit further teases Percival with the secret of what the Graal contained, before revealing that it held the Eucharistic bread, he tells him that it did not have in it, quote, a pike or lamprey or salmon, end quote. which would be absurd things to place in a chalice.
So the idea that it's a plate or dish, the kind of the communion dish is sort of a common, in at least some of the medieval sources is somewhat common. There's a communion wafer that's always there.
Its use in other vernacular texts in the south of France confirm this, and we even have the words of one Cistercian monk of Froidmont, who in 1220 explicitly identifies the word Grail with the Latin gradale, and furthermore states that, quote, gradalis or gradale in French means a broad dish, not very deep, in which precious meats in their juice are customarily served to the rich, end quote. Thus, the Grail, if Detroit originally meant it to be related to the Last Supper at all, can only be viewed as the platter from which Christ and his disciples were served. It appears only later to have been confused with or combined with the chalice often depicted in art as having caught Christ's blood, which may actually be meant to depict a different cup altogether, not one that he drank from at the Last Supper, but one that the Roman soldiers used at Golgotha when offering Jesus a drink of vinegar and gall just before crucifying him. Beyond this misreading of the source, which resulted in the invention of a holy chalice, there have been other misreadings, the most famous of which being that the Old French phrase Saint Grail, or Holy Grail, was actually intended to be parsed with the G at the end of the first word, making it sang ral or sang real, meaning royal blood. This was, of course, popularized by Michael Bagent, Henry Lincoln, and Richard Lee in their best-selling 1982 work of conspiracist pseudo-history, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which claimed that the Holy Grail really was a coded tradition referring to the progeny of Christ and Mary Magdalene, who had traveled to the south of France and founded the Merovingian dynasty. This refuted claim was afterward further propagated by Dan Brown in his blockbuster novel and film, The Da Vinci Code.
The Priory of Sion crap. Yeah, and it's so ironic that just as that theory was starting to wane in popular culture, then Dan Brown picked it up and gave it a whole new lease on life. And it's just like, God, we almost got rid of that, and then Dan Brown comes along.
Again, check out my episode, The Priory of Sion and the Quest for the Holy Grail, to hear more about the flaws with their theories and how they were actually the victims of an elaborate hoax. Here, it is more relevant to focus on the fact that they were not the first to misread the source material in this way. In the 15th century, an English contemporary of Thomas Malory, John Harding, was the first to misread the Grail texts in this way. And in his work, The Secret of the Grail leads Galahad to undertake a crusade and set himself up as a king over the Saracens, to quote-unquote achieve royal blood, as it were. Nevertheless, Harding's interpretation of the term, which has been expanded upon ad nauseum, was incorrect from the start. In the original Grail text, Chrétien de Troyes never even called it a Holy Grail. Thus, there was no such phrase to be parsed. The closest he came was when he says, Tant sainte chose est le Grail, or so holy is the Grail, likely because it held the Eucharistic host that prolonged the Fisher King's life. But this phrase can in no way be parsed to fit the royal blood interpretation, unless de Troyes meant, despite many spelling errors, to nonsensically write, so bloody is the royal. And even if you accept the later continuations as canon and believe they were truly finishing the story de Troyes intended to write, the Grail is never associated with blood as the lance is. It holds a communion wafer. In the later extrapolations of Robert de Boron, certainly it is said to have caught Christ's blood, but we have seen this story was an adaptation of the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, which also contains no mention of any vessel catching Christ's blood. Beyond these misreadings, however, there were also further reimaginings of the nature of the Grail throughout its numerous literary treatments. For example, it was at one point viewed as a book written in blood by Jesus himself.
The most intriguing possibility is that it is in fact a book written by Christ in his own blood, which I find a very interesting possibility because I'm kind of a sucker for stories about magic books. Jorge Luis Borges wrote about magic books in a lot of his magical realist fiction in the 20th century, and that trope comes down to us into Harry Potter and that sort of thing. So I find that interesting.
This interpretation appears to have been invented in the framing story of a 13th century French poem called the Grand Saint Grail, in which Christ is said to have appeared to a hermit in the 7th century and given him the book, which contained the history of the Holy Grail, and making it clear that holding the book itself conferred the same effect as holding the Grail.
Yeah, it's basically like the ultimate testament of Christ, and it's lost, and only the righteous can access it or whatever. But that's presumably what it is the ultimate testament of Christ.
Another reinvented version of the Grail comes from 13th century German knight and epic poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, who in his work Parzival reveals the Grail to be a stone. In fact, when this is revealed, it seems more like a revelation of what the Grail holds, the thing which extends life. Not the host here, but a stone which can prolong youth and extend life, which is called lapsit exilis.
Wolfram von Eschenbach conceived it as a stone. We're now firmly in the medieval period where so many of these legends reference each other, and so yeah, you get into alchemical texts and alchemical stories and things like that.
This description of it as a stone that confers long life would, of course, cause alchemists to view von Eschenbach's work as yet another coded hint regarding the Philosopher's Stone. And it does make sense for alchemists to equate the Grail with the object of their perennial quest, which may be used to create an elixir of life.
It was said to have similar properties that many stories say the Grail has, where it could confer eternal life or enlightenment or, extreme old age or, whatever the legend is. So there clearly are connections there. And I think there are connections because I think these medieval writers would crib from one another.
Indeed, they read von Eschenbach and they suggested, much like the San Graal Sang Real misunderstanding, that he must have written it incorrectly because lapsit exilis means nothing in Latin. They will say that he must have meant lapis, which means stone, and that perhaps he meant the stone of elixir, or maybe lapis exili, the stone of exile, or lapis excellis, the stone from heaven, or even lapsavit excellis, meaning it fell from heaven. This last view of von Eschenbach's Grail stone has even led some to identify it with the black stone of the Kaaba, thought to be a meteorite, about which I spoke in depth in my last patron-exclusive minisode. The simple and disappointing truth of the matter, though, is that Wolfram von Eschenbach was, by his own admission, illiterate. His poems taken down by dictation. Likely he just made up a Latin-sounding term with no deeper meaning, and most probably got the idea that the Grail contained a precious stone from a misunderstanding of Chrétien de Troyes, who described the Grail as made, quote, of fine pure gold, and in it were set precious stones of many kinds, end quote. The truth that should be emerging here is that no one, not even the earliest of the poets who wrote about it, had a clear conception of what the Holy Grail should be, and so they just made stuff up. Nevertheless, these disparate notions of the Holy Grail did eventually cohere, and the myth became so widespread and such a part of the medieval zeitgeist that real physical chalices began to crop up and be claimed as the genuine article.
I do a rundown in the class of some of the major contenders for the Holy Grail. the Holy Grail, assuming that it exists and assuming that it is a chalice of some kind, which are, as we've seen, not slam dunk assumptions. But probably the leading contender is the chalice of Valencia, which has been in Valencia, Spain, since at least 1437. This one's the leading contender because it has sort of the unofficial endorsement of the Pope, because Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict both recently celebrated Mass with it in the 20th and 21st centuries. So it's like, this is the real Holy Grail. But of course there are others as well.
One is the Sacro Catino, or Sacred Basin, held in Genoa Cathedral. It's worth noting that the provenance of both of these relics cannot be confirmed to precede the Grail romances, thus making it quite apparent that they were claimed to be the Holy Grail only after the literary tradition had become popular.
There's one in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City that has been claimed to be the Holy Grail, and I mentioned in my class, how disappointing is that the final resting place of the Holy Grail is New York City? that doesn't really grab you as an ending of a great medieval romance. Just catch the subway up to the Met, and you can see it anytime you want.
The very fact that there are competing relics that only appeared after the birth of the legend goes to show that they are all, most likely, cases of pious fraud. The term pious fraud is used to refer to deception, such as the counterfeiting of miracles, meant to increase faith, with the idea that the ends justify the means. But in this context, we refer to the phenomenon of churches claiming to have sacred relics in order to bolster attendance and encourage pilgrimage for the principal purpose of boosting their earnings.
This whole thing is clouded by pious fraud, which was one of the big industries of the Middle Ages. And this is, of course, the phenomenon that churches and communities in which churches were located had a vested financial interest in presenting artifacts that they could claim were connected somehow to saints, particularly, or even to Christ himself. And because there was no way to authenticate these things, you could have as many of them as you wanted. There's, tens of thousands of holy thorns that are said to be from the crown of thorns that Christ wore at the crucifixion. There's enough holy nails out there where you could build an entire house with just holy nails.
Indeed, it appears that a chalice said to have been used by Christ at the Last Supper, along with a lance said to be the Holy Lance, was being displayed and drawing pilgrims from the British Isles to Palestine as far back as the 7th century, another possible origin for the legends, but likely also another case of pious fraud. I've spoken about this phenomenon before, most recently when I pointed out that any church that had possession of the actual Ark of the Covenant likely would not have kept it a secret, and more specifically when exploring objects such as the Veil of Veronica, the Guadalupe tilma, and the Turin Shroud.
The Shroud of Turin is remarkable in modern times, not because it's supposedly the burial shroud of Christ, but because it's the one shroud of Turin, there were many, that has actually survived into the modern era. There were all kinds of artifacts in the Middle Ages that were claimed to be the same thing. Look, this is the burial sheet of Christ. No, this is. And it just so happens that the one that's now in Turin is the only one of that large universe of potential artifacts that has survived. It would be much less impressive if there was a Shroud of Turin and a Shroud of Bologna and a Shroud of Barcelona, but, there's not.
The legend or myth of the Holy Grail survives today not only in Italian and Spanish cathedrals, but in fiction, in novels and films and television. And it has maintained the interest of readers and viewers because of the inventions of conspiracy speculators who have further mythologized the Holy Grail as a secret kept hidden by shadowy secret societies, and especially the Knights Templar.
Whenever the Knights Templar make an appearance in popular culture, I just kind of roll my eyes. Conspiracy theories love the Knights Templar, and they can, weave them into literally anything. So the thing is going on now because there's a series now called Mrs. Davis. It begins, the first scene of episode 1 is the trial of the Knights Templar in 1307, and then they're trying to hide the Holy Grail. So the Grail is sort of a MacGuffin in this in this show as well. It's, made this year, 2023. So this idea of the Holy Grail being associated with the Knights Templar is, very hard to eradicate from the public mind. As a historian, we have to kind of bust some of these very cherished myths that many people have about the past.
As we saw with the Ark of the Covenant, the Knights Templar, or the Order of Solomon's Temple, were a Catholic military order organized to protect pilgrims to the Holy Land during the Crusades, and they became a wealthy financial institution as well, forming a kind of proto-multinational banking system. In 1307, the order was suppressed by King Philip IV of France, who was indebted to them and leveraged rumors that they worshipped the devil in order to wipe them out and seize their wealth. The Knights Templar certainly kept a hoard of valuable items in their treasury, all of which was seized by the French crown. And the notion that they had acquired some religiously significant relics from the Holy Land seems believable enough. But history tells us that the treasure seized by King Philip was in part composed of coin and predominantly in the form of land. Any valuable items that they held were being stored for clients who deposited them with the order for safekeeping, since the knights could better protect them. Again, they were essentially a banking organization. There is no evidence that they dug up the Temple Mount and carried the Ark of the Covenant to France. And there is even less reason to believe that they had a real Holy Grail in their possession. First of all, we have no reason to believe that the Holy Grail actually existed. And if we think of it only as the cup used at the Last Supper, or the cup of vinegar and gall served to Christ on Golgotha, or simply as whatever early pious fraud was being displayed in Palestine as such a cup back in the 7th century, we have no reason to think it was kept at the Temple Mount by Muslims before Crusaders sacked it, or that it had been buried there centuries earlier, as is the legend of the Ark. But more than this, the timeline simply does not make sense. The very beginning of the idea of the Holy Grail began in the 1180s, when Chrétien de Troyes wrote his poem, and the first concrete sense of the Grail as holy relic would not arrive until the first continuation of his poem years later, whereas the Templars were founded around 1120. If the Templars were indeed founded in order to protect the Holy Grail, as the legend would eventually claim, why was there no sense of this in the original lore? In the first Grail romances, it is protected by the Grail family of the Fisher King, and when Robert de Boron fleshed out the myth in his 13th century adaptation, he has Joseph of Arimathea taking it out of the Holy Land long before the Templars ever existed.
From what we can tell from the medieval legends, the Grail was taken back to Britain by Joseph of Arimathea and then apparently remained there, or somewhere else in Europe, but it's never mentioned as being in the context of the Holy Land.
Thus, if we are to believe the Templars discovered it in Palestine, then we cannot believe the rest of the background about its relevance to the crucifixion story. In fact, the first explicit connection of the Templars to the Grail legend seems not to have arisen until 100 years or so after they were stamped out in France, in John Harding's Chronicle, as he claimed that when the fictitious Galahad learned the Grail secret and set out on crusade to achieve royal blood and set himself up as a king in the Holy Land, he founded an order of knights, the Order of the Royal Blood, based on Arthur's Round Table. And the Templars, he said, were thereafter founded and modeled after them, and the Hospitallers after them, in the same fashion. It was a clear attempt to draw some parallel between Catholic military orders and Arthur's knights. And it probably doesn't need to be said that Galahad and his Order of the Holy Grail never existed. This first explicit link between the Templars and the Grail is tenuous at best. Most conspiracists who are looking for a stronger link go back to the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, he who imagined the Grail to be a magical stone. For in his work, Parzival, he mentions that while the Grail was entrusted to a certain dynasty, it was kept at a certain temple, rather than in a castle, as the previous romances had depicted. And he uses a certain word, Templese or Templesen, for the keepers of the Grail. It has been argued that Eschenbach actually meant Templar, but there is little reason to believe this. The Templars were not well known in Germany at the time von Eschenbach was writing, and according to his description, there were women among these Templesen who took care of the Grail, which seems to make it quite clear that it wasn't a fraternal order of knights he was describing. And it must be remembered that Wolfram von Eschenbach was illiterate, or at least said himself that he could neither read nor write. So like his faux Latin term for the Grail, lapsit exilis, it seems likely that his Templese was just another nonce word, a fictional name for a fictional group, and Templar conspiracists have since read into it, seeing what they want to see. And that is an apt explanation for all the Grail lore, from the authors of the continuations, who imagined a more sacred nature of the Grail, to Robert de Boron, who connected it to the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, to Thomas Mallory and John Harding, who used Arthurian legend to reflect 15th century English politics, and on from there with, as we've discussed, ideas of German nationalism inspired by Wolfram von Eschenbach's work, and themes of spiritual and psychological significance found by New Agers and Jungian writers, and conspiracy speculators assembling elaborate pseudo-histories based on questionable readings of medieval poetry. In this way, the quest for the Grail, as a quest for knowledge and understanding, is quite real, even if the secrets revealed at its conclusion may be, like the sources of the myth, more fantasy than fact. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. Once again, click on the link in the episode notes to go to hellofresh.com/historical16 and use code historical16 to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. Check out the blog post for this episode, which should go up on historicalblindness.com sometime before the next episode, for a transcript, related imagery, and further reading, like the wonderful book The Holy Grail, Imagination and Belief by Richard Barber, which was an indispensable source in this episode. Special thanks again to Sean Munger for chatting with me about the Grail.
Sure. Well, you're welcome. This is a pleasure.
Check out his work at gardenofmemory.net and sign up for his online classes, including his class on the Grail at seanmunger.com. You can easily find his channel on YouTube also by searching his name. And you should have a listen to his podcasts while you're at it, Second Decade and Green Screen. As always, thanks go out to my partner patrons, including Sean Munger, as well as Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Michael Markham, Mitchell Shuttler, Jessica Reeves, Fred from Colorado, Robin Naggett, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Logan Houlihan, Lily Powers, Lonnie Coffer, Ralph Fenn, Emma, Lee Holland, Kevin Osborne, and Ed Shockley. Thanks for joining me at this round table and for undertaking so many quests with me. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and The Conspirators. The wannabe Indiana Jones-style music used in this episode is called Adventure Theme by Adam Monroe and was licensed commercially through Pond 5. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Other music on this episode is copyright Alex Kish. Visit alexkishmusic.com and contact him to get compositions for your own projects. Additional music by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes. Or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, it may seem silly that some have treated works of fiction like the Da Vinci Code as if they are reliable sources of accurate history. But we see that ancient works of fiction like the Grail romances have long been mistakenly treated like historical records, resulting today in supposed non-fiction works of pseudo-history like The Spear of Destiny and the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which inspire movies like the Indiana Jones films and novels like The Da Vinci Code. It's all simply part of the mythologizing of our past. And you have to look past these stories and look deeper into history to find the truth. Or you can be just like everybody else and enjoy them for fun adventures, as I'm hoping to do with this last Indiana Jones film.
Have you ever wondered how inbred the Habsburgs really were? What women in the past used for birth control? Or what Queen Victoria's 9 children got up to? On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. Join me every Tuesday for History Tea Time, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel like wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I like to call redacted history. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.